Welcome to Tea Book Club, a discussion on James Baldwin's Go Tell It on the Mountain. This event is presented by the House of Chanel.
For Gabrielle Chanel, reading was a refuge which allowed her to invent her own destiny right from childhood. Literature became a passion she shared with the love of her life, Boy Capel, and her friends like Cocteau Colette, Pierre Riverdi, and Max Jacob. She helped the authors she admired without them knowing. She had the story of her life told by Paul Morand, Louise de Villemorin, and Michel Dion. She read for inspiration and then became an inspiration herself. Watch the film Gabrielle Chanel and Literature at InsideChanel.com.
Hello, I'm Hanya Yanagihara, and I'm the editor-in-chief of Tea Magazine. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for the first installation of the Tea Book Club. Over the next few months, we'll be reading classic works of American literature, beginning with our first pick, James Baldwin's 1953 semi-autobiographical novel, Go Tell It on the Mountain. Illuminating Baldwin's important early work and leading our discussion is author, professor, and tea contributor Ayanna Mathis. I hope you enjoyed tonight's presentation, and please visit teamagazine.com for more information about Baldwin's life and to sign up for future sessions of the Tea Book Club.
Good evening. I'm Ayanna Mathis, author of the critically acclaimed The 12 Tribes of Hattie, a New York Times bestseller. I'm currently working on my second novel, A Violent Woman, which is forthcoming with Knopf. For the very first Tea Book Club, I'm thrilled to talk about James Baldwin's 1953 semi-autobiographical novel, Go Tell It on the Mountain. Afterwards, I'll be joined by Tea's Thessaly LaForce for a discussion on the book and to answer your questions. I should begin with a bit of a personal note about one of the central aspects of Baldwin's brilliant debut. He was only 28 when it was published. That central theme is, of course, religion, and more specifically, the Pentecostal tradition. When I was 19, I read Baldwin's Go Tell It on the Mountain in an African-American literature course. I had never heard of it or of him. It was as though, across decades and geography, Baldwin was speaking the answers to questions I had not even known how to articulate. This is what literature, at its very finest, can do. This novel has been a beloved friend of mine since that first encounter I had with it so many years ago. In any case, Baldwin himself was born in Harlem in 1924, into a devoutly Pentecostal family, rife with swirling angers and hidden dangers. Baldwin was raised by his stepfather, David, who was resentful that young Jimmy, as the family called him, was not his child. David was a hard man who used his religion, he was a deacon in their church, as a weapon to bludgeon the family into a kind of submission. And he used it to create a kind of fiefdom inside the walls of that household, in which he was king, though certainly in pre-civil rights America, his powers and standing vanished the instant he walked out of his front door. Baldwin was smart, sensitive, gay, and an artist. He was also, which he wrote about extensively in an essay of his entitled Down at the Cross, he was made aware at a very early age of the dangers a Black child of him, like him, might face, the dangers of the avenue, as he called it in Down at the Cross. Those dangers were the white cop, the corner bar, the jail cell, despair. The Baldwin family understood the church as the only real protection against these dangers. As you can see, there are many echoes of Baldwin's formative years in Go Tell It on the Mountain, and in particular, many echoes with young Baldwin and the 14-year-old protagonist of his novel, John Grimes. Go Tell It on the Mountain takes place on the day of John Grimes' 14th birthday. On this day, he wakes in deep existential turmoil. He's coming into an age of accountability. He must choose some path to follow, lest his soul and body are lost. John is not yet saved. He hasn't accepted Christ as his savior, as have the other members of his family and his church community. But John is resistant to this. He is looking for some other something that he can't quite name. As readers, we understand that this something is freedom, racial freedom, intellectual freedom, sexual freedom. On his birthday morning, John's mother gives him a bit of spending money as a gift. and John hurtles through Central Park and into Midtown, where he goes to see a movie at one of the big movie theaters on 42nd Street. Movies, it's important that I mention here, are strictly forbidden in his religious tradition. The film that he sees was a very wise choice on Baldwin's part. Though the film isn't named in the novel, it's very likely the 1934 version of Somerset Maugham's Of Human Bondage. In that film, the thrilling Bette Davis, who's playing Mildred, mesmerizes John with all of her worldness. Baldwin writes of her that she is, quote, a little woman and not pretty, with a lewd and brutal swagger, saying to the whole world, you can kiss my ass. John, Baldwin writes, I quote here again, wanted to be like her, only more powerful, more thorough, more cruel. Mixed in with this sort of reverie for this woman's sinfulness, as John would have called it, and her defiance, is a kind of racial awakening. It is also Bette Davis or Mildred's whiteness that seduces young John, and by extension, the white world beyond his Harlem home. All of that presents itself as a kind of glittering and corrupted freedom. Of course, Mildred's defiance leads to her squalid death. John understands this with weary resignation, as another indication that he must give himself to the church wholeheartedly if he wants to find any safety at all. This bitter lesson is reaffirmed for John when he returns home to Harlem to find in his very living room the wages of sin laid out on the couch in the form of his black sheep younger brother, Roy, who has been stabbed in a knife fight with some white boys. This incident catalyzes a deep reckoning for every member of the Grimes family, for John's parents, Elizabeth and Gabriel, and his aunt, Florence. At Saturday evening prayer service later that same day, each of these characters find themselves prostrate before the Lord, sunk in a kind of reverie of their past sins and their past pains, of the joys that they lost, and of stolen moments of happiness that seem to be followed for these characters by years of bitterness and difficulty. Each adult in this novel carries with him or her some deep and painful secret which has been her undoing. Gabriel, John's father, unbeknownst to young John, is not his real father. Elizabeth, his mother, was in love with a tragic young man who died before he even knew that she was pregnant with his child. Florence, too, has her secrets. I wanted to pivot very briefly to talk about the structure of the novel. It takes place in a mere 24 hours, and it's divided into 3 parts, the longest of which, by far, is the middle section, which Baldwin entitled The Prayers of the Saints. In this section, the novel enters deeply into Florence, Gabriel, and Elizabeth's long ago past. I think that some of the genius and power of this section is that these stories are not rendered through the film and haze of memory, but instead they're told to us as though each one were unfolding before us in real time. There's an immediacy and an urgency in these sections. We experience them rather than feel like we're being told about them. I'd like to spend a little bit of time with Baldwin's marvelous manipulations of time. I think that his use of time and his handling of time is key to understanding this novel. And it represents a very early foray into what will become a feature of some of Baldwin's fiction. That is, his intense, repeated exploration of pastness as an essential element, and also as a vehicle for exploring both the individual circumstances of his characters and, by extension, the larger historical realities in which they unfold. In Go Tell It on the Mountain, Baldwin uses the middle section, the Prayer of the Saints, in which these characters go back into their deep pasts. He uses this section to lift these characters and us as readers out of the forward movement of time in the novel. He disrupts the flow of time to tell us these stories of the past that loom so large in the lives of every character in the novel. It is almost as though these events exist outside of time. In a sense, these events take on a kind of element or character of myth. They begin to have a timeless quality. In each of the saints' prayers, these prayers begin or take place nearly in their entirety in the South. The South is the place from which each of these characters migrated at some earlier point. John is in essence a first-generation Northerner, the child of immigrants who left the Jim Crow South as part of the Great Migration. The migration itself is among the most significant shifts ever to have happened in this country, culturally, demographically. 6 million Black people left the South between 1917 and 1971, profoundly altering the country politically, culturally, socially, artistically. Without the Great Migration, we would not have jazz. We would not have hip hop. We would not have a Michelle Obama or an Oprah Winfrey or a Toni Morrison. For a little bit more about the Great Migration, or I should say a great deal more about the Great Migration, please check out Isabel Wilkerson's seminal text on the subject, The Warmth of Other Suns. To return to the novel and its situation, there's a terrible silence about the past in the Grimes family. The angers of that household, its sadnesses, are all surrounded in a terrifying hush that is broken often only by fits of rage, though occasionally, mercifully, tenderness also finds its way into the family's rooms and hearts. There is something so astute in Baldwin's writing here. That silence that hovers over the Grimes family is so characteristic of immigrant families in general, I believe, particularly if the family fled some terror in their homeland. After all, it's important for us to remember that the Great Migration is an immigration story. It's simply that it happened within the borders of a single nation. The desire that John Grimes' parents have, and that many first-generation immigrants have, the desire to shield the children, to protect them from the pain of the past, is often companioned by an equally ardent desire for those children to succeed in the new context. So often a chasm opens between the first and second generations, a kind of unknowing that is terrifying and infuriating, and very often leaves the children only partially equipped to move forward. I think Baldwin does a superb job of handling this in the novel. John's parents love him deeply. However, they want to protect him. They want to shield him. And in their doing that, John doesn't know why his father is so bitter toward him. He doesn't know why his mother is so sad. He doesn't even quite know why the church is the only path of safety that's available to him. While he's certainly aware of the immediate dangers of, as I called it earlier, the avenue, John has no real sense at all of the dangers that his parents endured in their Southern past, and therefore he has only limited knowledge of what he himself may encounter as a Black boy in America. So you can see how Baldwin uses the granular, the specifics of his character and their circumstances, their psychology, to gesture toward these immense historical realities, and societal ones too. Certainly, white supremacy and its evils figure quite prominently here. Lastly, of course, this is a novel about the exacting religious tradition of the Grimes family. Baldwin was an outspoken critic of many aspects of Christianity, and very much so of the faith in which he himself was raised. In the novel, that faith is narrow, confining. It is easily weaponized. It is rigorous and a difficult path to follow, with all of its stringent requirements and prohibitions against things that so many of us understand as commonplace: dancing, going to movies, playing cards, drinking alcohol. At the same time, Baldwin has often remarked on the fact that there are great beauties in the church in which he was raised. I'll quote him here. Quote, "There is no music like that music, no drama like that drama." Another quote, "I have never seen anything to equal the fire and excitement that sometimes, without warning, filled the church." I want to point this stuff out because it seems to me that Baldwin is able to hold two seemingly opposite values and ideas in his mind at once: The church, on the one hand, as narrow and uncompromising, but still valuable, still meaningful, still beautiful. Baldwin lives in and with those contradictions. There is a spiritual, cultural, and psychic nourishment in the church. It has been, for many, many generations of Black Americans, a haven of sorts. From sin, yes, but also from the unceasingly obsessive gaze of whiteness. At the same time, Baldwin critiques the fraudulence of performative Christianity and the church as a place that is riddled with hypocrisy and moral equivocation. And Go Tell It on the Mountain, it is as though young John succumbs to the power, which is what the novel refers to as the Holy Spirit, the sort of spirit that leads him to his salvation. Young John seems to succumb to the power out of a paucity of choices. And yet, in the final pages of the novel, once John has accepted Christ as his savior, he turns to a dear friend of his in the church, a young brother named Elisha, and he says to him, "Elisha, no matter what happens to me, where I go, what folks say about me, no matter what anybody says, you remember, please remember, I was saved. I was there." We have a sense that young John knows that his desires and needs will eventually lead him away from his church. He's going to have to leave behind the pathos and transcendence of that tradition, leave behind the thrill of the church, the place and the people to whom he belongs, fraught though that belonging may have been. He'll have to leave it all behind in order to become himself. In a certain sense, it's a classic American story. The young person leaves home and, in some ways, can never return. Nonetheless, what has happened to him there, in that church, with those people, no matter what anyone says, mattered and will remain with him always.
Thank you. Wow, that was brilliant, Ayana. We're now going to have a brief conversation about the book. I'm Thessaly LaForce, Features Director of T Magazine. And if you have any questions or want to join in as a reader, you can add them to our Twitter conversation. Follow Ayana at Ayana Mathis, and I'm at Thessaly, and we'll do our best to answer them. Ayana, one of the most striking things about Go Tell It on the Mountain is, as you mentioned, the way it spans just 24 hours of John's life. It all takes place on his birthday. Baldwin said reading Henry James gave him this idea to sort of center the consciousness and use a single intelligence to tell the story. Can we talk about that sort of single intelligence? How does Baldwin exactly thread it throughout the book?
It's pretty amazing. I mean, I know it's pretty obvious that I have a lot of admiration for this novel, but he was so young when he wrote it. He was only 24, and yet he managed to find himself this kind of incredibly nimble and capacious narrator that could kind of do whatever he needed that narrator to do. One of the characteristics of it, I think, is that it's pretty consistent with itself. That is to say that it has this sort of very interesting omniscience at the same time that it avoids feeling arch or overly distant or sort of hovering so far above or outside of the events and the characters that we as readers feel that we can't sort of descend into the story. I think we're really close to the characters in each of the sections. And there's an intimacy there that he's able to achieve because he's found this kind of magical balance of omniscience and a kind of close third person narration so we can really zero in. And the narrator sort of remains able to do that throughout the novel. And I think that narrator's consistency is what lends the novel such a feeling of cohesiveness and that might otherwise be really difficult to achieve. I mean, we're in 24 hours, we go deeply into, we move through time from a kind of present to the deep past. So that's a lot of moving around. And I think it's this narrator's consistency that allows us to sort of never feel whiplashed and allows us to feel that we're sort of in a cohesive piece of literature. The other thing that I want to say about this narrator that I think is really interesting in terms of the consciousness itself is that there's something very biblical about it, I think. It's highly dramatic, it's highly knowing, it's possessed of a certain kind of gravitas and also a sort of smoldering outrage, I think that there's really something of the prophet in this narrator. And that, I think, is wonderfully consistent and resonant with so many of the biblical references that are present in the novel in general, which often are revelations or the prophets. So there's this really lovely kind of dance here between that narrative voice and that narrative intelligence and the kind of themes and underpinnings of the novel.
That's fascinating. Just to sort of drill down a little bit with this consciousness question, I feel like the other thing Baldwin does is he's almost able to slow time down. The opening section, I don't know how many pages it is, it almost feels like I'm moving through seconds of John's life, not even minutes. He gets the money from his mother, he takes a walk through Central Park, he goes and sees a movie. I mean, how, as a writer yourself, like how do you create that sensation of slowing time down, and then also, as he does in moving so far back in time, kind of speeding things up?
I think that's largely due to a kind of deftness or a facility with granular detail. So, in those early sections, we get so many details, this sort of pile up of details. He wakes up in the morning, how he feels, what the living room looks like, what the light is doing, the process of going into the living room and having to sweep the big rug, and how the dust clouds rise. And the writing is just so tremendously powerful and beautiful that never feels extraneous, but sort of has this effect of almost like a camera zooming in so we can see all the little details of this kid's morning and his journey. And then when he wants time to sort of speed up and become kind of sweeping, as he does in the middle section of the novel, I mentioned in my talk that the novel is divided into 3 sections, the longest of which by far is called the Prayers of the Saints, and that's right in the middle. And that's the section that sort of delves into the pasts of his adult relatives, mom and dad and his aunt. And in those sections, we're still getting this like deeply sort of story-like detail, right? So we feel like it's unfolding in front of us, but we have less of that sort of granular detail. It's almost as though the camera is kind of sweeping a little bit more over the action. And in this way, we get a sense of things that kind of happen, because many of those stories are things that have happened over a long period of time. A couple of years in a person's life, or even more than that, in the case especially of his father and his Aunt Florence. And then, of course, we come back out on the other end of that into this very brief section that ends the novel, and we're back very much in real time. And that section does something really interesting to me. It puts us in actual time, I would say. Like it feels much less like time is being manipulated to be accelerated or decelerated, but we're just sort of with him as things unfold. But then it has this really interesting leap into a kind of futureness right at the end there, when John says something to the effect of, forgive me, I don't have my book in front of me, but he says something to the effect of, he's talking to Elisha, his sort of brother in Christ, as they say in the novel. And he says something to the effect of, no matter what anybody says, no matter what happens, you'll remember I was there. And there's something that is being signaled to about a future that is going to be, and that this kid somehow intuits, is going to be very different from what he has lived. So there's almost this sort of nod to an off-screen futureness. So I think he's really deft with time. And it's one of the things I think that Baldwin does magnificently in a great deal of his work. Most notably a story like Sonny's Blues, which is probably one of the, many people argue, one of the finest short stories ever written. And there is this deft manipulation of time that is complicated and strange and, all the things.
Yeah, beautiful. You mentioned dirt, which I want to touch on because Baldwin kind of makes these allusions to dirt. There's, obviously their last name is Grimes, but then also in the opening, John has to clean the house and he's sort of cleaning this rug and the dust just won't go away. What does the dirt mean? What is Baldwin alluding to with these sort of mentions of it?
Those mentions are always hard for me. I mean, I think one of the great things about a novel that is sort of resonates with you is that there are things in it that you grapple with. There is this sort of equivalence that's being made, certainly between dirt and sin, obviously, like in the sort of religious context of the novel. So this sort of filth that cannot go away, cannot be washed away, no matter what human hands attempt to do to get rid of it, human hands cannot get rid of it. The sort of religious part of that would be only God could get rid of it. So there's certainly all of that going on, I think, with the dust and the crevices and etc. But I think there's also something going on with a sense of how John understands his Blackness as something like a mark of shame or something. I don't think that he has any desire to not be Black or to get rid of Blackness, but I think that the novel is gesturing towards a sense in which the larger white world looks at Blackness as burdensome, as dirty, as problematic, as all of these sort of awful things, and that there is an extent to which this child, John, has internalized some of that. And so I think that there's a gesturing that is happening towards this complicated equivocation between Blackness and dirt, and also shame. I mean, Baldwin talked a lot, Baldwin speaking as himself, talked a lot about when he wrote that novel, that some of the things that he was trying to sort of write into or understand were his shames and his fears about Blackness, about being poor, about being religious, about all these kinds of things. So there's a great deal of shame in this novel. So, and that's the last thing I think that I would say all of these mentions of dirt and filth might be gesturing towards is also shame.
Mm-hmm. You touched a little bit on the sort of biblical references that Baldwin makes, both just in the voice, but obviously with some of the language. One quote that I feel like stuck out to me was "Set thine house in order," which feels like a larger refrain for the book, but also for much else of Baldwin's writing. What do you think about that?
I think that's absolutely the case. I mean, one of the things that I think is, and this notion that in effect, that is essentially what is happening to every character in that novel, right? Is that their houses were in fact not in order, right? There were all of these secrets and angers and sadnesses and all of these kinds of things that nobody talked about, that nobody could mention, but that were acting on all of these people all of the time in very destructive and difficult ways. Their houses weren't in order. And so there's this sort of that middle section of the novel that we talked about, the prayers of the saints, that's so long, that is about when each of the adult characters goes into these kind of reveries about their past and their pains. There's a reckoning that's happening, not just sort of with God ostensibly, but these reckonings that are happening inside of each of these individual characters. And I think that is a form of setting their houses in order. And certainly with John, he's kind of, he's 14 on the day of this, the day that the novel begins. And so he's kind of entering into an age of a kind of accountability. And so he's sort of at this kind of precipice in which he too is being asked to set his house in order. What are you going to be? There's a great line from Baldwin's essay, Down at the Cross, in which he talks about his own experience. He talks about feeling as though something in the world was going to have to own him. He was going to have to be owned by something. And it could be the rigors of the avenue, as I talked about, in my talk, right? The cop, the pool hall, all of those dangers, or it could be the church. And this question that he mentions over and over again, he says it twice in Down at the Cross, is, whose little boy are you? And so in a certain way, where John is when we meet him is he's being asked, whose little boy are you? And he's being asked to decide whose little boy he is, in fact. And that is a form, I think, of sort of setting his house in order effectively.
Mm-hmm. And how, could you talk a little bit about how Baldwin uses prayer in the novel?
I think, I have a hard time with that one because I think, I think that the whole middle section of the novel is a kind of an act of supplication, certainly. Not just to God, but I think also to the the kind of personal traumas that each of these people are carrying with them, their very individual circumstances. And I think also a kind of supplication to the larger historical realities of Blackness in America in this pre-civil rights world, certainly to the realities of a kind of Southern Blackness in a Jim Crow South. So, I think that prayer functions both in the literal sense and ends up being a kind of vehicle by which we can get to all of these stories, about Gabriel and Elizabeth and et cetera. We sort of are effectively entering into their prayers, which I think the book uses as a way to talk about some kind of communication with a larger other, right? And that would be God. But I think also, so prayer is being used quite literally, but then I think also prayer is being used kind of metaphorically as a way to talk about how one might communicate things over which one has very little power and which are much larger than oneself.
I see. Yeah. And so Baldwin, if most people know, he was a teen preacher, and apparently he was really good at it, actually. And in his Paris Review interview, he sort of compares it to like jazz improvisation, in that you read the text and you know your stuff, but you have to get up there and then respond to whatever that energy, that crowd, those people are in front of you. What's interesting when I sort of learned more about Baldwin's life was, when he turned that direction towards the church and was a very successful preacher as a young man, he sort of rejected the life of the arts that he had also been cultivating. And why is that such a binary?
I mean, I think it certainly depends on the religious tradition that you're coming from. Pentecostalism is particularly rigorous. It is particularly stringent. It has extraordinarily high demands in terms of not just what one believes, but how one believes. And I think in some ways that an artistic temperament might find itself chafing against the kind of confines of something that is sort of so rigorously defined. Mm-hmm. And I think certainly that Baldwin did. And I think also some of the sort of theological underpinnings of Pentecostalism and probably to some extent, arguably, Christianity in general, at least in the way that he was living it at the time, would be difficult to reconcile with some of the things that he wanted. Certainly his sexuality would be a thing that would have been in play, even though I don't know how clear he was about that when he was very young, at that age. He became a preacher when he was 14 and stopped when he was 17. So it also seems that it's a sort of natural kind of thing, a kind of kill your fathers type thing so that you can sort of emerge later. And I think it's very important to note that Baldwin, though he was an incredibly outspoken critic of Christianity in general for very many reasons, also at the same time always talked about how the church was indelible in him, how much it sort of imprinted itself in him, what it meant to him. That, like John Grimes says at the end of the novel, I was there. And the fact that he was there matters. So I think, I don't know that I don't think I would say that art and religion is a binary, but I think that I would say that probably in one's formative years, in a religion that is very strict, there is going to necessarily be a kind of shrugging off to some varying degree that also gives you distance to figure out what the heck you make of the whole thing.
And I mean, maybe just to approach it from another angle, it's like, I know you mentioned in the talk and also in your essay that you were raised Pentecostal. And, what for a question I have as someone who was raised an atheist, what does it mean to break free of that tradition? Like, how much does that cost you? How much did that cost Baldwin? Like, how much of a rupture is that?
I mean, I think for Baldwin, it was a pretty profound rupture because, he had sort of staked a big part of his identity was not just sort of not extended beyond even just being a parishioner in the pews, right? Like he had become a preacher. So a great deal of his identity, his culture, his time, his everything was invested in that identity. So I think that it was probably quite a rupture for him. And then it was also almost necessary to be as kind of violently angry at that tradition as he was, that the sort of measure of his anger at the tradition is exactly commensurate with how much it meant to him and how deeply he had been invested in it. For me, it was kind of way less dramatic than that, and kind of obnoxious. I mean, I got to be maybe 15 or so, and I'd go to church, and my mother would just get really angry. She basically stopped making me go to church because I would sit next to her in the pew, and I would just mutter under my breath the whole time, like, "Oh, these people are, I don't know what you're talking about. That doesn't make any sense." This kind of like, it was terribly obnoxious, and like the people in the pew in front of me are looking and they're like, "Oh, pray for her," and hopefully they did. And I'm glad if they did. But in any case, so it was this sort of, it was the actual process of leaving the church makes it sound much more kind of dramatic than it was. I just sort of obnoxioused my way out of having to go to church anymore, But in other terms, I think that I did spend quite a long time trying to understand, after I got over the phase of just being angry at church and about church, and I tried to be an atheist. I really tried really hard, didn't stick. I sort of tried to do all these kind of things that I saw as sophisticated and erudite and cosmopolitan, which was like definitely not believing in God. But it never worked, and I believe in God to this day. But I think after I got over that sort of angry phase, there was a lot of trying to understand what it was about that tradition that had shaped me, and what was valuable and what was beautiful and what meant something to me. And it turns out there was quite a lot. But for a while, I couldn't see it, and probably didn't need to see it, right? Like I needed to kind of go and do something else and think other thoughts and be angry and explore the world on a very different set of terms before I could kind of come back in some way, shape, or form to the religion of my childhood and to religion in general, and begin to think about those things on my own revised set of terms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm going to end with two questions from our readers. We have a question from Mina in California. How relevant is this book to the current Black Lives Matter movement? It's something, I guess this is me speaking now, that's been on my mind too, just because Begin Again was published this year, the Eddie S. Glaude Jr. book that's sort of looking at Baldwin as well. But yeah, what do you think of Mina's question?
I think that it's incredibly relevant to the moment. I think for a lot of different reasons. I mentioned in my essay that so much of who Baldwin was as a thinker, and certainly who he was as a writer, was kind of forged in the crucible of American crisis. And his way of understanding Blackness, of understanding himself, and all of that was very much informed by the times in which he lived. So we're talking about the sort of rise in a certain way, well, not fall, but aftermath of the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, all of these kinds of things that were happening at that time, Vietnam, all of this stuff. And sadly, we find ourselves here again, which would point to the fact that in a certain way we never quite left. One of the things that Baldwin says, not so much in this book, but when he's in his essays, when he's speaking sort of much more as himself and as a thinker, he talks about the fact that America is so often in crisis because America refuses to be honest about what it is, where it came from, how it started. And so it continues to invest in these false narratives about itself. Mm-hmm. And these false narratives about itself include things like white supremacy, racial violence, all of this kind of stuff. Foundational violence, right? Like we like to think, oh, well, racism in America is anomalous. Well, actually, this is a country that was founded on killing a whole bunch of Native Americans and owning slaves. It's not anomalous, right? It is part of the fiber of what this country is. Does that mean it's a terrible country and it's not worth fighting for? Absolutely not. Baldwin's point was quite the opposite. It is worth fighting for, but we can't fight for it if we can't even admit the problems that are at the foundation of the nation. And so he was saying that way back in the 60s, we got to see who we are and face who we are and understand where we are as a nation. Otherwise, we have no chance of survival. And we're at an urgent point in which we can decide to survive or we can decide not to survive. And he was saying that during the civil rights movement. And I think we're right back here again. We can decide to survive or not to survive. And the questions at play are the same. The circumstances are different, the times are different, but the questions at play are exactly the same. So Baldwin remains ever relevant, ever relevant. And of course, aside from the racial and the political stuff, he's just a really damn good writer. So he's always relevant because he's brilliant and because those sentences, and because those metaphors and all of the rest of it.
Yeah, he's a beautiful writer. We have a question from Rachel in New York. I've loved James Baldwin forever. My favorite book of all time is Giovanni's Room. Yet as a straight white female, how do I reread and appreciate James Baldwin when my life experience is so very different from his?
So that's an interesting question. I think that comes up a lot to and for writers of color about books that are written by writers of color. And I find it an interesting question because we don't pose that question about, say, Anna Karenina, right? Or Notes from the Underground, or, Persuasion by Jane Austen, right? Like we don't sit and go, I'm not a 19th century Russian landowner, so I don't know how I could ever possibly understand this book. We don't ask those questions. What we assume is that we'll figure out what it is that we need to know about the particulars to kind of get in there and read through. And more importantly, what we also assume is that something universal about the human condition is going to be communicated to us in those novels, right? The issue, I think, when people encounter writers of color is that, and I don't think that people mean to do this, it's insidious, and it is a product of many, many, many decades of conditioning and of racist conditioning. We come to these novels not assuming universality, not assuming that they have something broad to tell us about the condition of being human. We come to them assuming that they have to tell us something small about the particularities of being this Black person or this Chinese person or this Puerto Rican person in this time on this day in this place, and that they don't have anything else to tell us. And of course, if that's the way that we approach the novel, then of course we think, ooh, there's going to be some really high barriers to entry because I don't know what that is, One of the things that we need to do probably is to sort of revise the terms on which we approach writers of color. And we need to widen and broaden what we understand to be universal and stop affording that assumption and that generosity to only white writers, and to make sure that we're affording that generosity and those assumptions to writers of color too. Because if we don't, I think what happens is we do end up with these barriers, and people sort of spend their time in these books being like, well, I don't know what they mean by X, Y, but it doesn't matter. There's a lot of things that I don't know what, Dickens was saying, right? But I'm not kind of like, I'm not a pickpocket in 19th century London. I'll never figure this out. It's just, you enter into the novel and you read it and you find what there is to find there, So jokes aside, I think that question, which is a very, very common question and a very common predicament, particularly for white readers in America, is the product of a kind of segregation of our literatures. And we need to desegregate our literature. And then we won't have those problems, and then we won't have those kinds of questions, because when you really get down to it, they're not relevant, right? Like they don't matter any more than they do when you read anything else.
Totally. And Baldwin himself said he never wrote for any particular reader. He resisted many of the labels that people tried to put on him. I have one last cheeky question, which is, if you are a first-time Baldwin reader, what would be the next book or text of his that you would recommend, Ayanna? Mm-hmm. And this sort of two-parter of this is, what is your favorite Baldwin book in the canon?
Let's see. If I were a first-time Baldwin reader and I'd read this, I probably would go on to something like, one of two things. Either Giovanni's Room, or Baldwin's collection of short stories, Going to Meet the Man. Sonny's Blues, for example, is in Going to Meet the Man. And it truly is one of the finest short stories, I think, that sort of the last American century has produced. So I might sort of go there next. If I were new to Baldwin. For me, my favorite Baldwin is probably this novel, obviously, which I've gone on and on about at length. Also, some of his short stories, in particular, Sonny's Blues, not to be cliche, but it just is magnificent. And Baldwin's essays. I am, The Fire Next Time is probably one of my return to it over and over again. I mean, it is soaring and wise, and the writing is astounding, and there are such deep, complicated truths, and there's this sort of process of watching this mind in this elevated eloquence work out how it understands the world. And reading Baldwin's essays for me is not sort of like interacting with a text. It feels like you're sort of entering into a consciousness and interacting with that consciousness. His essays for me are just a really tremendous experience.
I couldn't agree more. Well, thank you. Those are all the questions I have.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure.
Such fun. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us today for our first of 4 Tea Book Clubs. And thank you especially to Ayanna for bringing this incredible book to life. You can find her essay about it on teamagazine.com and check out our conversation on Twitter. The next book in the series is Edith Wharton's The Custom of the Country, which novelist Claire Massoud will be discussing the week of January 25th. Please be sure to RSVP at timesevent.nytimes.com. Finally, we want to give a special thank you to all of our subscribers. You make our work possible, and we look forward to sharing great books with you again. Until then, have a wonderful holiday season, and we'll see you in the new year.